folks, welcome to another Omnist Hour. I hope you like the choice of music today. Seemed like a dancing day. You'll see why when I tell you what today's subject is. Okay, I'm going to title this one Sacred Geometry Demystified. I'm going to drop back to real fundamental basics and show you how sacred geometry began, and kind of approach it from the opposite direction from what you get from a lot of other presentations online, which kind of start with the complexity and move back to what they think is a simple explanation. I think that's in one way of going about things, but in this case, like most things, if you only approach a problem from one direction, you're liable to get a very stilted perception of what's going on. And if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that one of the core tenets of this philosophy, religion, what have you, of omnism, is approaching questions from multiple perspectives and not clinging to any particular set of fundamental assumptions that really can't be justified by the overwhelming body of evidence to the contrary. Okay, I'm also going to be experimenting using a whiteboard so I can try to illustrate some of the things I'm talking about. Okay, so to start out with, my premise that underlies everything I'm going to tell you is that much of what is told to us about creation, the various stories that we remember, the new stories that are based on science, the Big Bang story and so forth, they are all perspectives of a process that goes back to a beginning. Is that beginning the Big Bang? Well, that's a beginning. What is its cause? Why did the Big Bang happen? Was the beginning God? Why did God exist? How did God exist? How did all this start? Okay, one of the fundamental premises that I think you can't make any progress in human discussion of anything without is that thought creates reality. Now think about that. Our reality, what we perceive to be true, is based upon information that comes from our senses, that is processed and filtered by our sensory apparatus and stored in our brain. And our brain then munges that with all of the other input that it's received and processes it into meaning, if possible, or classifies it as bleh, WTF, what was that? Okay, and that may spark fear of the unknown. It may spark curiosity and lead us in a different direction, even if we don't understand what we have perceived, what we've experienced. Okay, what other kind of fundamental assumptions do we often make about perception? Well, one of the likeliest ones is that what I perceive is what everybody perceives, which is the most patently foolish and one-dimensional way to view anything you could imagine. Because anybody that knows or has thought about the problem knows that if I hold some object here in front of me among a group of people, I'm seeing a different version of that object than anybody else. They're seeing other sides of it. And, if it's a cube, if it's a Rubik's Cube, one set of people might perceive that this cube has sides that have all the same color or a certain pattern of different colors, and make the assumption that everybody else sees that same pattern. That is a reasonable assumption, but it's an incorrect assumption. Okay, so every perspective of what we call our reality is, to some extent or another, a very limited perspective of one particular sensory apparatus of one particular soul. And my other premise is that, and there's quite a bit of evidence to back this up, so I'm not going to go there now, but the soul is immortal. Our physical incarnation, our bodies, are not. They get recycled. They get reused. You have a certain amount of time to spend in any physical incarnation, and then you need to move on to something else. Okay, so now that we've got that background straight, I'm going to posit that there was a consciousness without form, without shape, that began thinking about creating. Okay? Imagine if you were sitting in an isolation chamber with your brain running. Even if you were trying to meditate away every possible thought you could have, you would be having creative thoughts. Your mind would be drifting. And, gosh, if you were a Buddhist, you might think, oh, crap, I'm failing. Oh, I need to go back to my guru and get another dose of his reality. Okay. I mean, or there's other people that could be thinking about, oh, I'm going to have a date with my girlfriend tonight, or they could be contemplating the most fundamental questions of the universe. Okay? And my premise is that all souls, all consciousnesses, all independent consciousnesses think. And they all have the same fundamental capacity for thinking. There's nothing particular that makes them think one thing or another, unless they are being influenced or manipulated by other consciousnesses that perhaps have developed a certain amount of skill in, let's call it, propaganda, in proselytizing our thoughts to others, even if those thoughts might not be based on reality, might not be based on truth. I think if you have seen the kind of people who get massive followings in social media, mainstream media, and look at what they're thinking and what they're selling, what they're trying to convince their faithful of, you can pretty quickly realize that it doesn't really have to have much basis in truth, much basis in any rational process of deduction. In fact, it far more depends on how much they've managed to control your emotions. What are emotions? Emotions are the energies that we generate through our thoughts. This is how consciousnesses communicate between each other. Okay, so let's get this whiteboard out and imagine that in some space, which might be well categorized as a whiteboard, there is a consciousness. Let's make this, I don't know. Am I going to get in trouble if I make it a black consciousness? Okay. There is some unit of consciousness, which is thinking. Thinking about creating. Okay. What can that consciousness create? A thought. A thought which one might give its own consciousness. That manifestation of the thought creates some other consciousness. Now, if there is no energy transfer between these consciousnesses, one might develop a whole sea of unconnected consciousness. Each running at their own speed, doing their own thing. Okay? Now, what if the next thought is, well, how do I communicate with this? How do I interact with this thought that I've had? Well, anyone who has spent much time studying logic knows that in order to explore the truth of something, you have to consider its thesis and its antithesis. You have to have a dialogue. Communication is dialogue. Okay? So, one might posit that this consciousness would create an alter ego consciousness that was programmed to deliberately take a counter position to whatever the first consciousness came up with. If this first consciousness was looking to expand its knowledge, that would probably be the most sensible way to communicate with this other consciousness. Now, of course, not all souls are sensible. Some are driven more by emotion. This consciousness might instead choose to make other consciousnesses that basically agree with them. A choir of adulating followers that say, "Yes, God, you did everything perfect. Oh, I'm so thankful for all the ideas you've given us." That's another way that a budding consciousness who might become a god could create. Now let's see what the implications of that are. Okay? Because that's basically the two poles of starting to develop a universe. Might be if you were a consciousness looking to develop some sort of a complex system. Okay? Well, if we follow the one model of creation, we end up with a whole bunch of consciousnesses that are basically at odds with the first consciousness. And unless the first consciousness has developed some rules of communication that allows it to overrule all of its antithesis children, it's going to find itself stuck in a sea of negativity and criticism. And I think anybody that has been in a situation where you seem to be the only one that sees things from your point of view and everybody else is like completely off in the weeds, you know that can drive you to insanity. Let's look at the other situation of, okay, let's make everybody think the same way I do and have this choir of adulating sycophants. Where's the creation in that? If they think everything this consciousness does, what's to differentiate them between that consciousness? If they are not allowed to think independently, they have some rules that force them to think and act the same way as their parent. You have a static system where nothing new is really learned. There's no debate, no discussion. Whatever the original consciousness comes up with is what all the others must accept. Well, that's obviously not a very functional creation. And perhaps most consciousness falls into one of those two camps of either unity of thought or disparity of thought, and doesn't develop much past that point. If you think of it from the standpoint of, I don't know, I was watching a YouTube yesterday about some of the newer versions of this old computer game called Life, which is basically creating a model of living creatures of some level of sophistication and seeing how it developed over multiple generations. And this is basically where folks are starting at to try to prove or disprove evolution. Evolution according to their idea of what evolution is, which, if you're a materialist scientist, evolution only happens because of random mutations. And to the level of sophistication these folks are doing these simulations, they're patting themselves on the back and saying, yay, see, it proves that random mutation can cause very significant behavior. QED, no God. Well, this is absurd. The level of complexity that they're working within is minuscule compared to the real complexity of nature. And the fact that they are writing these algorithms to program these simulations is proof that you must have some sort of creative genius behind setting up a system that evolves. So it's really funny because they think they're proving God doesn't exist when they're actually proving that God does exist. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's clean off our whiteboard, and I want to propose a more successful starting point for all this. So let's suppose that our first creator, let's make this fellow purple because I like that color better, decided, you know what? I'm going to create this other thing. I'm not going to dictate that they always take the anti-position. I'm going to let them mull over a problem and come up with their own conclusion. This is the essence of free will. Now, am I going to let this other consciousness run wild and maybe have better ideas than I do? Maybe not at first. Maybe I'm going to retain some sort of a control mechanism, a kill switch, if you will. And this is what I term the cosmic veto. Okay, so let's imagine these first two souls God and the first child, if you will, being connected by a set of rules of communication. Okay? Now, 2 points and a connection between them is essentially a string. And this is essentially the first string, the first team. Interesting how so many cliches of our language tie back to really, really fundamental things. So this first string was a mode of inquiry that perhaps the first consciousness pursued for some time. What were the parameters of this string? What kind of communication was there? How much communication was there? How difficult was this communication? One could imagine that as driving things like how long the string was, how many barriers to the string there might be that force it to follow certain patterns. Maybe those patterns represent ideas of exploration that have been mutually decided to be non-productive. At some point, this first string realized that, well, we have things that just don't go together. We've got ideas that we cannot agree on, and we can't come up with a way to resolve. And if you've ever been in an existential conflict with somebody else, where you just disagree so fundamentally that you can't, on something that you can't convince the other of with a logical, rational argument, or even with an irrational argument, it gets tense. And eventually, you're going to want to disconnect from that person. And the string breaks. Okay? So, this is not good, because if you've got a very tortured string or a broken string, the team is not going to be getting very far. It's either going to be having to make compromises neither one is happy about, or stop working together entirely, which is an option, but then it basically leads to the two consciousnesses going off and creating their own team. Okay, so that's a two-body look at sacred geometry. Not much you can do with it, and some definite problems. Okay, so at some point, that two-body problem led one of those two to think, what if we had a third? Now, the natural inclination of creating a third consciousness would be to give it the role of tiebreaker. Or maybe, God being a little bit smarter than the other one, he had his first string, and he had a secret second string to his backup processor, and allowed them each to develop their own opinions independently, and weighed them against each other and decided which one I'm going to side with. This creates a hierarchy that may have been quite satisfying for God, but you can imagine that these two other consciousnesses would eventually realize that, you know what, this guy is always beating me. No matter what I come up with, he's got a better idea. He's cheating. And if he can cheat, well, I can find a way to cheat too. So these consciousnesses create their own teams. And you essentially have an explosion of cheating that basically allows It's basically an arms race, because then the first creator, oh, I've got to cheat more. I'm going to create more teams for me, and you create this network of controlled opposition that basically convinces every soul that they have, it's every man for themselves. And that kind of rats on a sinking ship mentality is why they call it rats on a sinking ship. It's not going to work. Okay, well, how could those three souls create a system that might work? Well, one way would be that the three souls, either by mutual agreement or through the second two souls being pretty clever, might develop their own means of communication between each other. Well, that's a lot more fair. Then, two can team up against one and win. And that's not a bad solution. But what if God is right and these two other souls who are teaming up, these children, think they know better? And we see this pattern all the time in youth movements, don't we? Children thinking they know better than the parent because they have gotten to a certain point in their thoughts where they think they know everything. The Weisenheimer effect is what we call it in my family. My first two brothers were very definitely of the Weisenheimer stamp. They thought they knew everything. They thought they could do anything better than anybody else, and my parents were always wrong. And funny enough, I was this third child who watched the first two and all the puddles they stepped in, and finally listened to what my parents were saying, especially my dad, who had lived through the Great Depression and whose father was an elementary school teacher who had no income for the summer. So he would take his oldest child, who was the only one old enough to work, off to the fields to become day laborers along with all the illegal immigrants to support the family for the summer, because times were really hard and teachers didn't make enough money to support a family. There are so many things in my life that have led me to the talks I'm having with you. It's just phenomenal, and maybe we'll focus more on those at some point. But at any rate, what I think is happening here is you've got these three souls, and maybe they have a fairly good equilibrium here. But that's not necessarily an equilibrium that's based on correctness. If two can team up against one and say, oh, it's a democracy, the majority wins, that's hardly a good way of determining what is right, the absolute truth of anything. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this exercise any more than that. I wanted to get that far to stimulate some thought. Let's just not consider all the other alternatives, but kind of go down a path, and bear with me if you want to challenge it or posit some other way of developing this story. I'm going to bring in the physical world now, okay? The physical realms are manifestations of spiritual thought. And that's proven by the fact that, everything we see around us, the pyramids, the way sand is laid out in the desert, it's all got some organization that's based upon some kind of creative thought. It didn't have to be that way. Why do the elements have the properties that they do? Why is the speed of light what we measure it to be and not something else? Why? There must be a reason. And these things are not accidental, because there are so many relationships, so many synchronicities in the way things are structured from top to bottom in the multiverse that you can come to no other conclusion than this must have been organized by somebody really, really smart. Now, how did that happen? The fundamentalist creationists who like to believe in an almighty, all-powerful, all-knowing God would say, well, okay, there's this supreme force. Maybe this supreme force is one soul, maybe it's all souls. Doesn't really matter. There's some supreme force that is so smart, it thought of everything ahead of time, made everything perfect, and here it is. We're living in it. And this is kind of the point of view that started the whole postmodernist movement, because it's absurd. If you've ever read Voltaire's Candide or watched the wonderful musical version of it by Leonard Bernstein, you'll know that this best of all possible worlds was ridiculed as this is why, you Christians are all fools. That doesn't make any sense. It's absurd. And that's what caused us to go through a period of ridicule of religion. The sad thing is that the obvious conclusion didn't seem to occur to anybody. That monotheism, one God, was not the solution. That, oh, you know what? What does it really mean when they say we were created in God's image? If God started as a consciousness, as a thought-capable, disembodied spirit, then it would stand to reason that means that all of the children, all of the creations of God, would fundamentally have that same characteristic. Okay, well let me move on a little bit. I know I'm gonna probably skip things I wanted to cover, but I do want to get through some of the basics. Okay, so we've got this idea of connections being built up between independent or mostly independent souls with maybe some sort of a kill switch operated by God. Okay, now at some point these three souls decided that, you know what, we need a fourth soul. And I'm not drawing this very well. Imagine a tetrahedron. Okay, this is a pyramid with only three sides. That is essentially the representation of four souls that each have the ability to communicate with each other. Okay, now what can you possibly imagine that these three souls, realizing that adding a third as a tiebreaker was not the best of ideas, since the tiebreaker actually wanted to be as creative, wanted their thoughts to be as valuable as the first two. Well, at this point, these three souls were realizing we've got a problem. we still have we have a tiebreaker, but we really don't have any way to come up with a solution, something that is actually going to productively expand this little family of thought experiment that we've been creating. So one might imagine the fourth thing that they would create is something to give all of them the time to find a better solution. Okay, and I think you see where I'm going with this is now we've got a three-dimensional solid with 4 vertices. 3 dimensions plus time. This was the beginning of the first universe. It set the structural pattern for expanding beyond that. Now, once they had this set up, of course, these souls are all going to keep on creating, trying to win the game. And they've already learned that one of the best cheats you can do is to make some extra players that are sort of programmed to be on your team. And try to keep those players from communicating with the others for as long as you can, because it's already been proven that you can't isolate these souls indefinitely, no matter what kind of laws you try to put in, without making it a stale system that doesn't expand. It dies out, and I'll leave it for the life programmers to prove or disprove what I'm saying there. Okay, so basically this set of 4 souls created this first lattice of expansion. And what you will notice if you start building up solids from the three-sided pyramid is called a tetrahedron. You'll find that it's very difficult to make a regular pattern of tetrahedrons by connecting them in this way. Okay? And that doesn't bode well for making a lattice where a large number of souls can be used to compete for new knowledge, for expanding creation. So this was a nice idea, worked real well for 4 souls, but it didn't really work so well when you expanded it to more souls. Okay, so let's create a 5th soul. There's 1, 2, 3. Maybe this is God in the center, right? Okay. And of course, when we get them all communicating with each other, what do we effectively have? Well, looked at from the top, we may not see what it is, but looked at in the image behind me, what you see is that you have a 4-sided pyramid. And the apex of which, the center of which, the highest position is presumably God. Because that's the only soul that has the kill switch. The ultimate kill switch of saying, oh, I'm going to erase the whiteboard and start over. Okay, so let's see what the implications of building upon this pattern are. Okay, if you have studied geometry to any great length, what you will know about these four-sided pyramids is if you take a collection of four-sided pyramids and start building with them, you will discover that you can connect these four-sided pyramids to a central point let's see, gotta draw all these in. Okay, this is very complicated, but if you view these as solids, and I'll leave it to somebody else to draw it better than I do. I decided to go whiteboard because I couldn't find anything free that I could use very easily. Essentially, you've got, if you tear this apart, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 regular pyramids that all meet at an apex. And you can then stack these like cubes and build a very stable lattice structure upon which to operate this government of souls. Now, if you think about how that government might work in the context of having senior souls who feel like they might, by virtue of their precedence, have more legitimacy of rule, you would imagine that this universe would be structured not so much as an infinite expanse in every direction, but more as a pyramid with primary pyramid at the top, ruled by what one might call the first family of 5, overseen by God, and then lording it over this huge expanse of other families that basically build up the pyramid, the big pyramid, one layer at a time. And you can build as big a pyramid as you want and still maintain that structure. Now, you'll realize at this point that, who does God communicate with here? Unless you put in a mechanism for random communications that could upset the structure of this pyramid, basically you've got God really heavily influenced by these 4 souls just below him, and to a lesser extent by the souls just below that, who have to get the attention of one of these four before their idea might get before God. Okay? And I think you can see that this structure is very rigid, very authoritarian in nature, and not very flexible. And especially, even if you provide a mechanism by which souls can work their way up the pyramid or be demoted, it could take literally forever for a soul, even the most capable new soul, to ever reach the ear of God. And if you remember that one of the possibilities that can develop when souls become unhappy is they stop communicating with each other. Okay, so if souls stop communicating with God, essentially they have their own pyramid that they're working within. Not talking to the guy at the top. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I got better ideas than you. I'm going to use my pyramid of people and cut them off from even knowing you exist. And I think you can agree with me that there are many potential problems in any pyramidal scheme of organization, of independent, free-thinking consciousnesses. The ones at the bottom are going to get unhappy. Not only do they not have the ear of God, but they've got the weight of all these other bosses trying to tell them what to do, and then telling them something different because they got another order from on high. And every system of human organization that is based upon this pyramidal scheme of thinking is inherently very brittle. That's why globalism isn't working, because it's a pyramidal scheme. And it doesn't matter that you try to make the top be the smartest tool in the shed. We can see in spades how that falls apart, because at some point you've got a layer of the pyramid that says, you know what? We really know more than everybody else. We're the scientists. We're the blah, blah. We're the Faucis of the world. We know better than everybody else. And so what we're going to do is basically agree amongst everyone at this level of the pyramid that we're just going to make the top of the pyramid kind of a placeholder, a figurehead. And you see people like Reagan, Trump, Clinton, Obama, the Bushes in power, supposed power, who are basically just doing the bidding of this layer that has decided that they're the real government of a country or of the world. And the last 2 years have shown us in spades how absurd a world that leads to, where the power isn't really the power. The real power is somebody that doesn't have the accountability of power, has the power without accountability, and through control of the media, through control of messaging, communicates a reality to the rest of the pyramid that doesn't match what anybody who stepped a few feet away from the pyramid and looked at it would say is going on. And, I think what we're seeing is effectively the final collapse of this pyramidal structure of organization. And this is a reflection of what's going on in the spiritual world. Now, I'm going to show you what I think developed after this pyramidal structure started showing its cracks, showing that it didn't work, that we couldn't make a lasting, successful creation, physical or spiritual, based upon a pyramidal structure. Imagine, if you will, retreating to this first three groups of souls. Only maybe God's not there. God is disconnected. He can create without connections. God has the ultimate veto. He can make connections not exist, make souls not exist. Imagine that he arranged it for two sets of souls that thought they were operating independently. Then imagine that the coherence between these seemingly independent groups of souls was basically an indication that they were gravitating to the same truth and probably worth the effort of God to listen to, depending on what problem they were working on solving. Well, how would that look then if these two independent groups came into coherence? Well, it might look a lot like a lot like the six-pointed star, the Star of David. With God sort of represented as this center which gets activated when these groups, when these two teams come into coherence. One might call one team the divine feminine team and the other team the divine masculine team, and make the leader of one team one of the first three souls, one of the first Trinity, and make the leader of the other team one of the other one. Now that's a two-dimensional representation. If we want to take it to 3 dimensions, we need to make these teams of 4. And we essentially get the double tetrahedron, which is a very well-known symbol in the occult, and is actually, this Star of David is the 2-dimensional representation of what 3-dimensionally would be the double tetrahedron, which I think is also kind of equated with the tetragrammaton. The real name of God is when these double tetrahedrons come in focus and connect with God. Okay, so let's see if I can draw it. So we've got this set of double tetrahedrons. Okay, when they're perfectly balanced, they make a very beautiful 3-dimensional star. I think quite a bit more appealing than the traditional way of drawing a star this way. Have you ever thought to yourself why we have 2 kinds of stars that we talk about most? The 5-sided and the 6-sided stars? How much human conflict? How much of human history revolves around that? Were you aware? I think everybody's aware that somewhere embedded in our collective consciousness, we have a memory of a number system that was base 612 instead of 510. And in fact, there is quite a bit of evidence that at some point, the intelligent creatures on this planet had 6 fingers, not 5. And that clearly ties, in some interesting way, to the spiritual history of our species. It's also interesting to note that reports of alien encounters talk of beings with 3 fingers, or maybe 4 fingers. What's with how many digits there are? You can make biomechanical arguments about what the optimal number of digits are depending on what you're going to do with a hand. But I think you really can't get very far with that before you realize that, most of what is really important there is a matter of counting. Culturally, at least, that there's no other conclusion than that counting is the most important facet of that. At any rate, where I wanted to go with that, this is about as far as I'd like to go with sacred geometry. Other folks will go into tying it together with how fractals work, how a fractal equation can generate geometries that are much more complex, but all seem to tie back to some of these fundamental ones that all have their root in 3, 6, 9, 12 geometry. That seems to be something magical, and that's, the Tesla worshippers pretty much make that the centerpiece of their belief system, that somehow there's some magic in that number sequence that if we could just unlock, we would know all the secrets of the universe. And there's a certain amount of truth in that, like there's a certain amount of truth in anything. At any rate, where else do I want to go with this? I think what I'm going to go talk to you about from there is kind of hard to visualize, but imagine, if you will, that each individual soul now has the pattern of this tetragrammaton, this three-dimensional star made up of 2 tetrahedrons. Okay, well, how many vertices are there here? We've got 6 vertices. We've got how many connections? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 connections. And these things are not tied to each other. They're 2 independent. So, if we want to go communicate with other souls, we can make point connections at any point along here, but we really can't fully connect with them without either assimilating into their greater soul, which is effectively abdicating your free will, becoming part of a larger tetragrammaton, or exchanging, mating. And this is the essence of where sex comes from. The spiritual equivalent of sex is sharing male or female nature with another soul, allowing ourselves to be bound. How does that happen? Well, this solid has to, basically separate. And you've got basically what amounts to half a soul wandering around looking for a new structure to integrate with. And this is essentially what happens when we incarnate. We take on a physical form that is a separation of our whole soul into a spiritual self and a physical self. And neither of them has the full consciousness of the integrated soul. So in the spiritual world, your incarnation spiritually is looking for a spiritual mate. Your incarnation physically is looking for a physical mate. And by making this kind of a two-step process, you are able to find a balance between your physical nature, your natural inclinations, when you're faced with challenges, with limitations, and your spiritual nature, your natural inclinations, when there's no boundaries. And integrating those two into this perfectly balanced three-dimensional representation of the soul is essentially how we get to the point of becoming like God, of being able to have a direct communication with God, which is, you can think of as the center solid. It's not a direct communication with God. It is a communication with the God essence. What would God do is in the center of this perfectly balanced soul. The what would God do when you're incarnated is only a piece of that. You've got physical God and spiritual God at work. The God of limitations, the God of hardship and pain and suffering, and the God of unlimited possibility. And just as God does, by exploring those natures, this is why even God incarnates. Because no soul is going to develop into a responsible creator of things that are not constructed just for their own selfish comfort, unless these forces come into balance. And they can only come into balance through successive incarnations and reintegrations. Once they are in balance, souls who reach this kind of perfectly balanced state in the spiritual world, in the multiverse, anywhere, souls that reach this perfect state of being in harmony with the spirit, the physical and spiritual spirit of God, become what I would call a superfluid. They are able to move about and act as agents anywhere in the multiverse that they feel an affinity for. They still have their own characteristic. Each one of these special stars is an individual, has a very individual idea of what kind of perfection they know how to make. Maybe art, maybe a passion for dance, a passion for good organization, a passion for healing. Anything that we can think of as a human passion that sort of comes to consume us and becomes the most important thing in our life could be what's represented by this perfect state of one individual soul. And this perfect state is essentially that soul's godhood. And there are gods of everything. There are gods of frogs who just are really passionate about the survival and development of all of the species that are related to the frog. Amphibians, a very important set of creatures because they are the ones who are tasked with recovering from a cataclysm where either the water or the air becomes uninhabitable. And this is why we have amphibians, amphibious species. That's why that's part of the DNA code. And it's part of humans code too. Although we haven't exercised it in a long time, there are humans who are more readily able to adapt to the water than others. And should we ever be inundated with a great flood, it could be that there will be another group of humans who take to the water, or other species. This is how the whales and the dolphins developed. This is all part of a great plan. It is so well constructed, it makes the plans of mice and men look like the masturbation of the stupidest tribe of monkeys you've ever seen. Now that doesn't mean you shouldn't go investigate, try to become a scientist, try to do anything that you feel passionate about. It does mean that if you do it without the humility, the awe that you should have about the foundations that you are building upon, you're probably not going to do it very well. It means that if you're just looking to copy something, me to it, put a different stamp on it, one that's maybe more likely to sell in the current political climate, you're not creating. You're profiteering. And we've got to get to the point where the species understands the difference between profiteering and creating. Doing something with a passion for material wealth, material success, versus doing something with a passion for creation. For making something that's going to last. That's going to be useful a billion years from now when this planet is maybe just a vague memory in the history, the lore of 1,000 other planets all over the galaxy. Anyway, I hope that will stimulate some questions, other topics you might want to go into. I hope you find it useful. And I think it's about, we're over an hour, so I'm going to try to cut it short here. As always, like, share, subscribe. Please interact any way, which way you want. If you want to donate money, fine. I'm okay. I'm retired. In Indonesia, where it's pretty cheap to be retired, and I'm very, very happy with the new family that has adopted me, and my new wife, who is the most incredible person that I could imagine having found in this very strange journey I've had thus far in my life. At any rate, till next time, I'm Rob Tromp with the Omnis Tower. Thanks.